So today I am so curious for those that you are watching the live stream. If you're watching the replay or listening on the podcast, I would really love to know how many of you struggle working with parents in the play therapy process. And what's your biggest struggle? I'm going to talk today about some things that I think will are contributors to some of those problems, not all of them, some of the problems. And in my Play Therapy Academy, which is my online play therapy consultation group, the things that I'm going to talk about today come up all the time. Anytime I'm doing trainings, these come up. This come up a lot in Play Therapy Academy. So I talk about these a lot. And if any of these resonate with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. So post in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts. Also, if you don't want to do a comment, but I would still love to hear, message me, do a private message or a DM. So if you're in Instagram and you're watching on Instagram, or you're watching the replay in my Facebook group, because StreamYard won't let me Facebook won't let me use my streaming platform to stream into my Facebook group. And it's irritating. So if you're watching on the replay in my Facebook group or on LinkedIn, or maybe even Instagram or LinkedIn, or you're watching the replay in my Facebook group, then send me a message. I would love to hear your thoughts, hear what you struggle with. So send me a message. If you're watching on YouTube, feel free to leave a comment. I love reading all the comments. Also, if you want to send me a private message, then pop over to my LinkedIn profile, connect with me on LinkedIn, which is Kathy Spooner, Cathi. You can see my name on the screen if you're watching from LinkedIn. Or if you're on Instagram also, then my Instagram channel is Renewing Hearts Training. So let's connect. And working with parents. How many of you, if you are in the play therapy space, how many of you have struggled to figure out the best strategies that will work with parents? Now, this is usually the high functioning, kind of low acuity. Low acuity means that they're usually pretty engaged, they're pretty attuned to their kids, they're involved, they take your suggestions, they're really good about implementing them. They have a lot of really good insight into their kids. Generally, consistently doing a really consistent job at good enough parenting with their kids. And the main thing is they're pretty attuned. That's the main thing, I think. And they are receptive to feedback, and it's easy to build rapport with them. Those are the low acuity families that we work with. The more they start going up the continuum to the higher acuity families, those are the ones that get a little more challenging. And if they're really high acuity, then they're going to be a lot more challenging, because these are the families that typically have a lot of trauma and attachment issues, probably some poverty in the family history, maybe some addiction in the family history. They have a pretty significant combination of all of those issues. And so if most of you have probably heard of the ACEs. ACEs is adverse childhood experiences. So what we know from a lot of research is that the higher the ACEs score, the higher the incidence where they've experienced some pretty significant, challenging, tough situations. And I look at it as, well, if I grew up in that system and it's a generational system pattern, then of course it's going to be a struggle. We have to help parents be the therapeutic agents of change. And that's hard. The higher the acuity level of the parents, the harder the change will be, because you usually have that history, that multifamily history of some really challenging and difficult things going on. So when we look at it in that context, kind of makes a little bit more sense. From a practical standpoint, as a play therapist, it can be really, really challenging. So what do you do? So there are some things that I want to talk about today that are mistakes. And full disclosure, I did all of these. In the beginning, I did what everybody else did. Because I was learning, and I looked around, I had my supervision, and I just did what everybody else was doing because I thought that's what you were supposed to do. But somewhere along the line, I started getting really frustrated. And I thought, you know what, this is not working. And my default mode coming out of graduate school, in graduate school I have a master's in social work, and I went the clinical track. And my clinical track back in 1990 or 91 is when I did my second year. I focused on family systems. So that's my lens. And in fact, when I was in graduate school, I was 28 at the time, I was in graduate school, and they were talking about this thing called family therapy. This was like back in probably my second semester, first year, because I went full time. We learned about this thing called family therapy, and I was like this new convert, everything and anything, family systems theory. I always say that I'm a licensed clinical social worker with the heart of a marriage and family therapist, because I look at things systemically. And I've always worked with kids. That's always been my mission since I was little. I'm one of those, I guess, outliers. I figured that out. Not everybody knew what they wanted to do. I did. I was going to save the world. That didn't last long, which is good. We have to be realistic. I've always worked with kids. I've always worked with kids. And when you work with kids, you notice the family system. So with that kind of background in mind, when I started using these things that everybody else was doing, and they weren't working across the board, I mean, the higher functioning families, which are the lower acuity, they're going to be really easy to work with, but not all family systems are. And I don't think it's, all of us do this, and we get frustrated. We kind of blame the parents. But if we take a step back, we don't have control over choices they make. This was my theory when I decided, this isn't working for me. This, what everybody else is doing is not working for me, because my goal is always, always, always to get the best outcomes possible. And if I'm going to last in this profession, that was my dream. This is my dream calling. This is a calling. Most of you feel that way yourselves. It's a calling. It's not just a job. Then I had to figure this out, because I was getting really frustrated. And with my background in mind, so I took a step back and I looked at some of these things that I was doing because everybody else was doing it. And I realized, you know what? This is really not very effective. And I am part of the problem. That's what I have to own my piece in it. If I continue to do things that aren't very effective, I'm now part of the problem, and I don't want to be part of the problem. So taking a step back, What do I need to do differently to get different outcomes? So that was kind of my focus at the time. And the three things that I'm going to talk about today are the things that come up a lot when especially in Play Therapy Academy, because we meet regularly and we have a lot of discussions. If you're interested in Play Therapy Academy, I will talk a little bit about it at the end. In Play Therapy Academy is also this course that I'm going to talk about it. If you're not in Play Therapy Academy and you don't need that level of support, you can still get the course. But what I did is I took all of my 30 plus years experience working with children and families, kind of put it in this really comprehensive answer all the questions course. So if you're interested in that, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more at the end. And I address a lot of these things in the course as well that I'm going to talk about today. So today's focus is what's the best way to work with parents in play therapy? That's what we all want to know, right? Because as play therapists, if you're working with children, then you know children exist within the context of a family system. And who is in charge of that family system? Parents. Who are the decision makers? Parents. Who do you need to engage? Parents. What's the best way to work with parents? And I'm going to share three things today. This isn't all of them. It's just three things. There's a whole lot more to working with parents. And I'm just going to share three things today that come up a lot. So even changing these things creates a shift. That's been my experience. The first one is, and again, I did all of these as well, and they didn't work. It just didn't work. And so I'll tell you what it is. It is parent check-ins, doing parent check-ins. So saving parent check-ins for the last 5, maybe 10 minutes. You do your play therapy session. Then after the session, you walk your client out to the waiting room, or you invite parents back into the session at the end. And you have to figure out what to do with the child. Is the child going to hear us? Are they not going to hear us? How are you going to navigate that? Because what are you going to be talking about? So you do those check-ins. First and foremost, they're never 5 minutes. Okay. So another strategy that I tried, because everybody else was doing it, I did it at the beginning of the session. Parents wanted to chat, so I would bring them back and I would chat with them. 5 minutes turned into 20, and now half the clients' appointment is gone. They're frustrated because they want to do play therapy with you, and they're kind of frustrated because the grown-ups are talking, but they know they can't really complain because they're a kid and you're not supposed to interrupt. So it's never a 5-minute conversation, and it's rarely 10. It's rarely 10 minutes. So, and it's not really, the child is around. It doesn't really give you a dedicated time to meet and build really strong rapport. And the first time it kind of dawned on me this strategy wasn't working was when I was working with a family, because we're helpers. I want to help. I want to engage. I want to connect. I'm going to be as helpful as I can. So I'll accommodate and meet different needs, and I'll adjust on my end so I can be supportive. All of these things are good things, and sometimes they're not. So I was working with I had a family member of client call me. So the child wasn't living with the family member, but the family member did all the daycare and was really heavily involved with the child because parents were working first time. It was full-time working mom, parents weren't together, didn't have a good relationship, a lot of issues there. Most of you have probably experienced a lot of these yourself. So I wanted to be supportive. I was able to get mom to come in to do the intake because I won't do it with somebody who doesn't have legal guardianship. And then from then on, the other family member brought the child. I did check-ins with the child, and I had very limited contact with mom. And this went on for a few months. And I was trying to be supportive, and I would, try to have phone calls with mom. And I found that mom wasn't engaging. And then it became really clear somewhere along the line that mom really needed to be more involved. There were things going on systemically, right? You can't work with kids without looking at them systemically within their family system. I now look at things from an attachment lens as well. So if we're looking at it that way, and I'm using all my theory and research and how I have conceptualized what the issue is, that's your case conceptualization based on your theoretical models to help you understand what's going on. And then you need that to help you figure out what to do, right? If you've listened to past podcast episodes, or if you've been in my live stream world for any length of time, you'll have heard me talk about that. So then I thought, I really need to get mom to come in. So, and I know mom is busy, so I want to be supportive. So I make all my attempts, and I'm getting nowhere, and the problem is not getting any better. And so I finally have a conversation with the family member, and I say, listen, I really need mom to come in, and I'm going to not have sessions for a while till I can get mom to come in. And so I had mom come in once or twice, and we probably met maybe a couple more times after that. And then it started happening again. And so I try to accommodate, and I be helpful, and I try all the different ways. And I realize, like, this goes on for a while. And I realize, nothing's going to change. Like this is a setup for failure. And this isn't the only incident, right? This has happened numerous times. How many times have I had consultation with people, and we've in consultation, I'm talking with the play therapist, and they're talking about how they can't get parents to come in. They won't schedule, they won't come in. How many of you have had that struggle where you just can't seem to get them come in? There's always a reason. And they're legitimate. I am not saying they're legitimate, but here's the thing. And this is where your theory model comes into play. And this is why I love using a neuroscience and attachment lens, because it grounds my conceptualization, and that's going to guide my decision making. So if I have a full understanding of what's going on, and I now know what needs to happen for the shift, and it's not me, the system needs to shift, then what am I going to do to get that engagement? And the 5-minute check-ins at the beginning or the end are not the way to get the engagement. And that is the biggest thing I learned from the very, I would say probably within my first five, I would say 3. I lasted 3 years doing it that way. And then I was like, no, this isn't working. Because here's the other thing. Prior to, like I mentioned earlier, I've always worked with kids. That they have been my calling and my mission since I was little. So previously, I was a special education teacher while I was going to college in the 1980s. I worked at a summer rec camp for therapeutic rec. So we worked with the kids who had an IEP in school for something. Now, this was back in the 80s. Special education looks a lot different now than it did in the 1980s. But here's one of the things I learned from a very young age. Now, it's relative. Now it was young to me. what I noticed from the kids and even some of the volunteers that I worked with, their relationship with their parents and the level of involvement with parents with doing what I would now call a lot of attachment parent, where you're setting the limits, but you're tuned into your child, you're focused on helping them to become the best version, even with the limitations that they have compared to typically developing kids. The kids whose parents were involved, and these were all kids with IEPs, these were all kids who had some kind of special needs. But the parents who were more involved and challenged and supported their child, those kids thrived. Even some of my volunteers, because we worked with volunteers who were also had some special needs, and they were awesome. I could count on them to get things done. So I learned at a very young age, which I think is why, well, that and growing up the way I grew up, when I realized this whole family systems thing, I was like, oh, eureka, that explains so much. I was right. But I also saw that when in my work, and when I was a special education teacher, I saw it as well. So when I realized, oh, I don't want to do the teaching, I want to do the therapy piece, that's when I realized, you know what? I have got to form relationship with parents in order to facilitate that change process with them. Now, that's to me where your theory model comes in to be a big component. And I like using an attachment and neuroscience theory model within a family systems lens. So when I look at it that way, and I go back and I conceptualize all those little pieces to what the research says, to what the theory says, and how the theory explains things, then I can be even more firm and committed that I'm on the right track. So when I need to do some challenging, I know what I'm saying is grounded in what really needs to happen. Now I've been doing it so long, I've seen, I've had the experience of seeing that it is true. That's not to say we don't want to be black and white. At the same time, just using and doing what everybody else is doing isn't necessarily the answer. And I've found the 5-minute check-ins, and that's my way of working with parents, isn't going to work. To be more effective with parents, we really need to build a strong relationship. To do that, we need to have those meetings with parents. We need consistency with parents to build rapport, to work through any of those barriers that are going to come up, because they will come up. They will totally come up. And trust takes time to build. Trust with parents takes time to build. And the 5-minute check-ins are not really that effective across the board. So that's the first mistake, and the strategy using those 5-minute check-ins. I would say it is much better to develop a structure in which you're consistently meeting with parents and you're communicating that from the very first session. What is that going to look like? Which comes to my next thing, which this is also a big mistake because it becomes a barrier to doing the first thing that I talked about, which is doing therapy by email and text. I get that it's convenient. And I also understand there are some exceptions. But anytime you make an exception, you really need to be very intentional about why you're going to be communicating therapeutic information by text or email. I mean, here's the reality. I just talked a lot about building a rapport. That's a face-to-face thing for the most part. Somehow it's a face-to-face thing. Do you really want to be having conversations and building rapport with parents electronically through an email? or through a text, especially when you start working with the higher, once they get up to they start moving up that continuum to be more higher acuity, do you really want to use a format that that has a lot of, how shall I say this? A lot of potential for things to go wrong. In an email or a text, it's kind of hard to understand nuance of language, voice tone, facial expression. It's a little easier to do that in a phone call. It's much harder to do that via email or text. And I get that it's convenient because you just kind of pull out your phone or pull up your email and type out something when you have time, and the parents can read it when they have time and they'll respond. But here's the thing, is it really that convenient in terms of your time versus scheduling a parent appointment? Here's what I mean by that. How much, I don't know if you're about me, but like me, but I take a lot of time. If I'm going to put something in an email, which is now a written document, and now part of the therapeutic record, because it's a written communication, it is also here in the United States, that's considered part of the client's medical record. So if I'm going to do that, then I'm going to take the time to be very intentional about what I write. How much time does that take? That takes a long time, especially if you have to kind of, like me, you have to read it a couple of times to make sure you got everything right in there, and you're kind of checking your words to make sure they're neutral and all of those things, just like you would for your documentation, progress notes, and all of those things. Is it really more time consuming? Because then they're going to respond via email and you're going to respond. So it's a back and forth communication. Text and email is a communication. It's a two-way process. So is it actually time saving? And how much time do you really have in between sessions? Probably not very much. So you're taking a lot of time doing this when you're not seeing all your clients, versus you are having regularly scheduled, consistent meetings with parents where you are addressing these things. And if you're a fee-for-service provider, you don't get paid for those phone calls and emails, most typically, depending on the agency you work for and how they do the billing. But if you're in private practice, outpatient clinic setting, the likelihood you get paid for sending texts and emails and all the time that it takes is probably pretty slim. But if you work for an agency and you get a salary, you probably are. That being said, though, you probably are supposed to be seeing clients. You have to meet a certain number of clients. So how much time do you really have in between session? So one, is it really building the rapport? Two, is it part of why you're burned out? Because you're responding to all of these in between sessions. How much time does that take when you could be doing progress notes or some other documentation that you're probably behind on that you need to catch up with? And instead of that, your expectation is, no, we need to have consistent meetings. We need to, we're going to meet this often for this period of time. Here's what we're going to accomplish in these sessions. That's going to reduce and give you more time back. And it's going to build your rapport. You're going to be able to start building that trust with parents. So emails and texts, are they really that effective? I don't think so. The third thing is related to the first and the second, are phone calls. So how many of you And again, this is typically once you start going up that acuity continuum, this is usually the more the higher acuity family systems, right? How many of you, especially in the beginning, but maybe somewhere along the change process, somewhere along in there, you're getting phone calls in between sessions, maybe 2 or 3, maybe 1, distressed phone calls from parents. They're calling you after hours. They're calling you during the day. They're calling in distress, and it's not working. What you're telling them to do isn't working. Their child is still having all this emotion dysregulation. Nothing was working. The teachers are telling you, parents, that nothing's working, and now they're calling you because you're the expert and they need you to do something. They need you to fix it. So they call you and they want you to fix it. At the same time, you haven't been able to get them to come in for parent sessions, right? These are the ones you're probably muttering under your breath or to a trusted colleague going, where you're just frustrated. And you want to secretly figure out how to refer them to somebody else, right? And you're also taking the phone calls. You're also calling them back. You're also doing that therapeutic work over the phone with parents in between sessions. So and again, you might have to. I'm not talking about like the life or death, and they are legitimately in distress. But here's the thing. If you had set the expectation about here's how often we're going to meet and here's what we're going to accomplish, then when they call you and they have these things that they're saying, your response on the phone is, that sound, you do some validation because it is. They are in distress. They are worried. They are scared. They are frustrated. They need this fixed. Very legitimate. So your response on the phone is, that sounds really distressing. I totally understand. When are you available to come in for a meeting? Here's when I'm available, because this is a longer conversation and we need to have a session. So you book a session. Instead of taking the phone calls in between the sessions and you're responding to all of those, but they're not coming in, you need to work with them to come in and get into the habit and make that a priority. And again, your theory model, mine is attachment and neuroscience. And based on my theory model and all that I know about that, about emotion regulation and co-regulation, identity formation, building resiliency, all of these things, I know that because that's what the research and the theory tells me. Then I know I can be confident that when I'm asking, the hard thing that I'm asking parents to do is the thing that they need in order to get where they want to be with their child. So this is how we engage parents as those therapeutic agents of change. We have to set expectation based on what we know is important in order to help parents bring about that change that they want for their children. So that is it for today. This was kind of packed full with all my opinions, but I will tell you, once I made this shift, doing what everybody else was doing, then I just the shift that I would see in families was phenomenal. So let me just do a quick recap. Really, first and foremost, those parent check-ins for building rapport aren't really the most effective way across the board to build that relationship with parents, because parents need to trust you before they will make those hard changes that you're asking them to make. And they need to use your support through that change process in order to bring about the change that needs to happen. And they need to trust you in order to do that. To really use your support, they need to trust you. And the way to do that is really have consistent and intentional, regularly scheduled meetings with parents in which you are building that rapport with them and doing that collaboration, partnership of how do we bring about this change? What needs to happen and how do we need to bring about that change? The second thing is while emails and texts may be more convenient, easier is not always better because it is a communication. It's a written communication. So you really need to be intentional about that. That takes time. It takes time to write those. Also, emails and texts have a tendency where you can't really communicate as effectively because it's too easy to be misunderstood and for triggering the something in the relationship and not understanding fully. They take a lot of time and they're really not the most effective way. There are certain situations in which it is indicated. It needs to be the exception rather than the rule. And when you do that, you really need to be very intentional about your clinical decision making for using text or email versus having those parent conversations. Because nowadays, we can do video sessions. We could do teletherapy. You can meet with parents via teletherapy. Now, there are some nuances with that state by state, how that can work. And we have more options now. And then the third thing is teletherapy. Therapy by phone call. Do you really want to be doing therapy over the phone with your parent, with the parents of your clients, and responding to all of those kind of crisis responses when you're not having them come in and having that intentional time, that 45 to 60-minute time on a consistent basis to build that rapport to help parents become those therapeutic agents of change that they need to be for their children in order to bring about the healing that their children need so that their children can be the best level of functioning that they're able to be. So that is it for today. If you're interested, I do have a really comprehensive course called Getting Grounded, Partnering with Parents in Play Therapy. This course has it all. Takes my 30 years of experience using a neuroscience and attachment lens. The reason I think it's important to add that neuroscience and attachment information in there is because that's going to influence your clinical decision making and also how you're understanding the problem so that when you're making decisions about what needs to happen, it needs to be grounded in that. And so I go over the neuroscience and attachment and how that explains parents' role in the treatment process so that when you're asking parents to make those changes, then you actually have that grounded in some clinical data to help your parents understand why they need to be involved and help you set those expectations. And I walk through practical things also, like how do you set up those sessions? What are your decision making? How do you handle difficult and challenging situations? Some of the practical things are in there as well. I also have a whole module on working with I call them reluctant parents. They're reluctant to engage. So a lot of strategy. And again, that's where that neuroscience and attachment lens comes in pretty heavily when you're working with reluctant parents. How do you get that engagement? And I kind of walk you through that process. And the thing is, the other thing that I like about using neuroscience and attachment, especially in this parent training, is because pretty much most of the play therapy models, you can integrate neuroscience and attachment into your theoretical model. And then as a bonus, because I get asked all the time whenever I am working with people and we're talking about parents and working with parents, especially children from high conflict divorced family systems, How do you navigate that high conflict parent relationship? They're typically court involved. How do you navigate that successfully and help to reduce your anxiety? I mean, most of these are hard families. They usually have multiple systems involved. So there's a whole module on that about working with parents and how to navigate some things to think about as you are working through that process. And then I also put in there some templates for policies and procedures because I get asked for that all the time. So I figured, you know what? I'm doing a comprehensive course. Let me just put it in there. And that I get asked a lot about that. And people usually find those really helpful. So if you're interested in the course, then pop over to my website at rhplaytherapytraining.com/courses. You can click on the courses page and register for the course. If you're interested in Play Therapy Academy, which is my online play therapy consultation, maybe you need a lot more support than just the courses. You need a dedicated, consistent time to get support to help you apply all of the things that you're learning, to build your confidence, to build your clinical decision-making process. I have Play Therapy Academy, which is my online play therapy consultation program. It includes twice monthly group consultation calls. So you have my 30 years experience plus all of the wisdom and resources and experience of people in the group. And then it comes with all the Getting Grounded courses. We have a group chat for support in between sessions. In between meetings. And so it's kind of, I call it like a VIP experience to give you the support that you need to kick imposter syndrome to the curb and feel more confident and competent when you're providing play therapy. So I will see you next week. Bye for now.